working class can very much, in fact, relate to Palestinians and what Palestinians are going through. But the problem is that, there's leadership in the labor movement, and there are gatekeepers in the labor movement that prevent those conversations from even coming into those spaces. And that's what we really need to resist, not just around Palestine, but also in all the ways that union dues or our tax money is used to oppress anyone.
Welcome to the Harmony of Interest series, where we explore ideas that shape our world. My name is Evan Papp, and I'm the executive producer of Empathy Media Lab, which focuses on content on labor, political economy, art, and culture, and we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. We are recording this on Friday, May 21st, 2021, and today I'm speaking with Labor for Palestine organizers Suzanne Adely and Michael Letwin. Suzanne is the co-director for the Food Chain Workers Alliance and president-elect of the National Lawyers Guild. Michael is a public defender in New York City and former president of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, UAW 2325. Suzanne and Michael, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So to set up the framing of this conversation, earlier this week, Palestinians pulled off a general strike. Haaretz reported that the Israel Builders Association said 65,000 Palestinian construction workers observed the strike, with only 150 coming to work in Israel. This caused a $40 million loss for employers. Unfortunately, many of those who observed the strike were reportedly fired. So before we talk about your organization and the recent violence, could you talk about work conditions for Palestinians?
Sure. I just want to start by saying that, yesterday's general strike was important and another historic one. And I think that it really kind of succeeded in galvanizing solidarity and support from around the world. And, general strikes that workers engage in, as well as consumers and students, and have always been a strategy of the Palestinian struggle, and I think have always been a tactic of colonized people as a way to challenge the power of those who are colonizing them. We have been reminded this past week of the 1936 general strike that took place in Palestine against the growing sort of Zionist European settler colonial movement at the time, which lasted for about 7 months and was one of the largest in history. Likewise, strikes have always been a very kind of important component of Palestinian resistance, including in the 1980s Intifada and the second Intifada that we saw kind of emerge around 2000, 2001. These strikes are meant to really challenge Israeli violence against Palestinians in the form of occupation and humiliation and all the things that we're going to talk about. But they also use to sort of highlight the specific kind of experience and circumstance of Palestinian workers. I mean, as you said, it was estimated that about 65,000 construction workers who are Palestinian and who the Israeli economy depends on did not show up for work. They make up the majority of the construction economy within, throughout both the kind of occupied territories of the West Bank, where there has been, a lot of construction of illegal Israeli settlements, but also in 1948 Palestine, which is now Israel proper. And that's not the only, part of the economy in which is the kind of Israeli colonial regime depends on low wage Palestinian labor. And so, in addition to sort of being a worker in that kind of very precarious condition, the precariousness kind of created by the political economy, but just by sort of the power structure of being an occupied person and your employer kind of being the one that is occupying you, or being a colonized person and your employer being the one who is colonizing you violently, right? And there are also other sort of circumstances of the occupation that Palestinian workers have to face on a day-to-day basis, which is the inability even to get to work and be paid because of checkpoints, right, where they're subjected to humiliation and violence on a daily basis. Or also, Palestinian workers from many different sectors were subjected to the violence of the Israeli military occupying forces, as well as to the violence of armed settlers, right? I mean, there have been cases of bus drivers who've kind of been killed en route to work. There are cases of many workers kind of being brutalized also as they're working, as well as en route to work. And those are some of the additional kind of daily conditions that Palestinian workers have to face, in addition to just the economic exploitation that comes with their precariousness.
And if I could add, the strike, the general strike on the 18th of this, earlier this week, what involved, even by mainstream reports, even in the New York Times, reporting that there were hundreds of thousands of Palestinians involved in that general strike. And what was striking about it, I think, and so empowering, is that it spanned all of historic Palestine. I mean, the Israeli state and the Zionist project that underlies it is organized to separate and divide and fragment and ethnic cleanse the Palestinian people, and including the Palestinian working class, so that you've got Gaza, which is under bombardment, and then you've got the West Bank, which is also under military occupation, and then you've got the 1948 territories, which Israel calls Israel, but we don't call it that. We regard it as part of historic Palestine. So in all of these different places, and especially the West Bank and in the 48 within the Green Line, this is where this strike took place, and it broke through those kinds of divisions that the Israeli system, the Israeli apartheid system, creates to keep people separate, and both from each other and from everybody else. And that was tremendously empowering. I don't know, Suzanne, whether there's been a general strike of this scale, certainly since the intifadas of 20 and 30 years ago, but perhaps even back to 1936. So there's a tremendous feeling, I think, of empowerment and hope that brings, because it is one aspect of resistance that involves masses of people. I mean, there are many forms of resistance. There are protests, there are children throwing stones at Israeli tanks, but it's all David versus Goliath, including this strike. And it shows the power that people have to resist.
And so much of labor is focused on solidarity. And there's a question of, there's a very large, almost state-sponsored labor union, and I would like you to talk a little bit about it, within the Israeli government and Israeli workers as well. And could you discuss what is Labor for Palestine, and what are some of the major themes of the solidarity struggle that you're supporting?
Well, Labor for Palestine was actually launched in 2004 to reclaim a legacy, really, of working class solidarity with Palestine that unfortunately has kind of been lost, because overwhelmingly labor officials in this country support Israel, and in fact have given lots of money to Israel and campaign for Israel within the government here, and make sure that this government sends the $3.8 billion a year in military aid to Israel to carry out the kinds of massacres that we now see and have seen from the last 73 years. So Labor for Palestine especially endorses the 2005 Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. It's really a picket line, also known as BDS. And BDS demands an end to occupation and apartheid, full equality for all, and the Palestinian refugees' right to return to the homes and lands from which they were expelled, especially since 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were made refugees by the creation of the Israeli state. And this really also reflects a much broader kind of labor solidarity for Palestine that exists around the world, where from South Africa to India to Italy now, with dock workers refusing to send military cargo to Israel, we've seen a growth and in that kind of solidarity. And that really reflects a couple of things. I mean, one thing it reflects is the historical parallel of the divestment movement against apartheid South Africa in the 20, 30, and 40 years ago, and even longer, which played a really important role in helping to isolate and topple the apartheid regime in South Africa. And labor around the world, and certainly in this country, was part of that in a big way. And unfortunately, that has not been mirrored in the kind of solidarity in this country, at least, that is required for Palestine. So our position and what we're urging is that just as an injury to one is an injury to all in regard to any legitimate labor struggle, so that's true with Palestine, especially as Palestine is under intense attack and has been for so many years. And the BDS movement actually has had tremendous success in in a variety of different contexts. And I think the fact, for example, that last week, Italian dock workers refused to send those weapons to Israel really shows the kind of power that workers in particular have. BDS takes many forms. A lot of it is consumer boycott, and that's important. A lot of it is demands on the government to do this and that, or on companies, or on trade unions. But what's so important about the power that workers have at the workplace is that it goes beyond resolutions. It goes beyond talk. It's to exercise the direct power that workers have. And in this country, there are a couple of important examples of that in the past, going all the way back to strikes by Arab and Black workers in Detroit in 1973 in the auto plants against UAW support for Israel. But more recently, in both 2010 and 2014, dock workers on the West Coast in this country, members of the ILWU, refused to handle Israeli cargo and turned away Israeli ships in observance of BDS. And that just shows that if we exercise that power that we have at the workplace, we can actually play a direct role in bringing down the Israeli apartheid system.
And could you just comment a little bit about labor Zionism and what the trade union federation known as the Histadrut, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, what that is and how that is not helpful to the cause of what you're trying to do as well?
Well, the labor Zionism is the support that some labor bodies have given to Zionism, going all the way back to more than a century ago, especially with the 1917 Balfour Declaration, and then the subsequent, in which the imperialist powers purported to give Jews a national homeland in somebody else's country, in Palestine. And also the rise of the Histadrut that you mentioned, starting in 1920. And so labor Zionism internationally really was at the forefront of creating of the Zionist, what we call the Zionist settler colonial project, which sort of parallels in many ways what happened in apartheid South Africa. And in some ways in what happened in this country with the dispossession of the native people and also slavery. But in the context of Palestine, it was people that called themselves socialists and that called themselves labor that actually were at the forefront of that settler colonial movement. And ironically, they never had any real support among the working class, either in this country or internationally. But they used those terms to kind of legitimize and whitewash, if you will, the Zionism to begin with, and then eventually the establishment of the State of Israel. And the Histadrut in particular, the so-called Zionist Labor Federation, was at the absolute forefront of that project. And using that kind of image of being a labor organization and even calling itself socialist, was able to recruit various kinds of labor leaders around the world, including in this country, to support Zionism. And that has been the status quo ever since. So for the last century and more, labor leaders in this country, especially starting in the 1940s, but going all the way back to those earlier years, advocated for the establishment of a Zionist state and made sure, and has made sure ever since then, that that Zionist state had the support of the various imperialist powers, but also the support of major labor institutions, certainly in this country. And so we have union leaderships who, without consulting the members, their own members, have bought millions and hundreds of millions of dollars of Israel bonds. They support every war on Palestine that occurs. They support the displacement of Palestinians. They support the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, although they don't call it that. And above all, they make sure, and they try to make sure at least, that there will be no support or to suppress support for BDS within labor. So for example, when labor bodies have begun to, a few labor bodies have begun to support BDS in recent years, they've done everything they can to isolate and silence those attempts to show solidarity for Palestine. And that's essentially what labor with Zionist labor or labor Zionism is. And the history in particular is really a federation of Jewish workers. And it's very similar in that way to the white trade union federations in apartheid South Africa, which talked about being a labor organization and talked about perhaps about other so-called progressive things, but in reality was a way of suppressing the indigenous people, yeah, both in apartheid South Africa and in Palestine.
So in an article titled "U.S. Labor Must Stand with Palestine," published on May 15th, the anniversary of the Nakba, Labor for Palestine wrote that this is not an Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not an Israel-Hamas war, communal clashes, or a civil war. So could you just talk a little bit about why it's misleading to frame the violence as between these two conflicting parties?
Sure, I can talk about that a little bit. You know, we've been struggling for a long time, and particularly within the United States, as to the way that the media and sort of other kind of institutions have framed, the Palestinian issue, and in ways that, on a spectrum from like complete and total pro-Israeli propaganda to kind of more liberal-minded tropes of like, well, we have to respect everyone's human rights in this conflict, right? And in my opinion, like neither of that is helpful. We have to say what this is, and what this is an anti-colonial struggle, right? Michael talked about, the Balfour Declaration, and around that time, we started to sort of, in the turn of the 19th century, you started to see an expansion of settlements in Palestine by European settlers who identified as Jewish and who were either part of or sort of being prompted by this new Zionist movement, right? And Zionism, essentially was a colonizers movement that said that as white European Jews, right, that have both a religious connection to the ancient world, but also have superiority as white Europeans, have the right to go and colonize the land of Palestine, without regard to indigenous people, right? And that movement of Zionism grew and became supported by imperialist powers, and in 1948, we see the establishment of what would become sort of the Israeli regime, right? And that is a moment that we refer to as the Nakba, which in Arabic means catastrophe, right? And May 15th, which was just this past Saturday, marked 73 years since the establishment of the Israeli regime. The Zionist colonizing project didn't begin 73 years ago, but 73 years ago was when we saw the establishment of Israel, and a moment in which hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled by force from their villages, a moment where we saw the direct sort of destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages or takeover by Zionist settlers. And when we saw several sort of examples of massacres by sort of the Zionist army at the time. And so, that was an important moment that, but it itself wasn't actually a moment. And the Nakba, which is this sort of a moment where we marked the establishment of Israel, was part of a colonizing project that has continued for over a century. So since 1948, then we now have sort of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and we have this sort of devastating economic embargo on Gaza as well. We've seen sort of the expansion of illegal settlements, throughout the West Bank. We've seen the construction of the apartheid wall, and we've seen sort of various moments of attempts by Zionists, both the settlers and the army that protects them, to continue to expel Palestinians, as we saw in Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah, and in the week that kind of like led up to this particular moment of violence. And we also, have been experiencing every few years the, periodic and devastating bombing of Gaza, people who basically are kind of living in an open air prison. So, all of this, like, going back to the turn of the century, this has been a situation where Palestinian people, the indigenous people of Palestine, are suffering settler colonial violence in all these different sort of manifestations, right? And Palestinians, whether they're engaging in a general strike, whether they're calling for BDS, or whether or not they're protecting their families with arms, right? This is Palestinians, this is indigenous people. These are people who are resisting and the colonizing power that is really seeking to annihilate them, right? It's not, and there's no comparison between kind of the military, economic, and political support that Israel has, particularly by, the U.S. empire and other sort of allies of the United States, and and what the Palestinians have, but what the Palestinians do have is kind of a resilience in which they, will continue to resist colonization. So it's, to call it a conflict is really kind of not just inaccurate, but it's just kind of, it's really absurd, right? And I think that, what we see is that, and whether we're talking about the right wing or sort of like liberal sort of elements, we see the continuing sort of tropes that are being used, but what about Hamas, right? That has nothing, that like Hamas's existence or non-existence doesn't change, right? Doesn't change that Israel is a violent colonizing power, right? And Hamas is an elected sort of leadership in Gaza who, for most people, whether or not they agree with Hamas's religious ideology, believe is kind of fighting for all Palestinians, right? To call it communal clashes, to say that this is about religion, or to say that this is something that is centuries old, between Arabs and Jews, is just not accurate, and it's just, absurd. I think too, but like at the same time, as somebody who's kind of been organizing around Palestine, we have seen like a marked improvement in the way that the media and institutions and people on social media are talking about Palestine. So, and, we've also seen, recent reports by organizations like Human Rights Watch, who have finally acknowledged that a system of apartheid is existing, in these territories. And we've also finally seen the International Criminal Court call for an investigation of Israeli war crimes, right? But it's still going to take more than that. Like, we need to, mobilize labor as well as, the grassroots to stand in support of Palestine, not just when they're victims, but also stand in support of Palestinians as they are working, resisting to liberate themselves from the colonizing power.
So I do want to talk about some of the demands and what peace looks like, and a very solution-oriented discussion. But I do also want to kind of, you've laid the groundwork where previously it was the Ottoman Empire, World War I happens, Sykes-Picot Treaty happens with Britain and France taking over much of this area. The British get through the Balfour Declaration, Prime Minister Balfour then pretty much says the Palestinian mandate is going to eventually be open to these European settlers. World War II, and then it goes right into what you were explaining as well. But just for those who may not have been following the recent conflict, ceasefire was announced yesterday, May 20th. And could you talk a little bit about just what was the actual spark that led to the most recent violence? I don't know. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think most recently, what we had seen was attempts by Israeli settlers to violently evict Palestinian residents of Jerusalem from their homes in the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, right? Those evictions had been happening actually for quite a long time. And you know, when I say evictions, right, what I'm really talking about are settlers, many of them who are US citizens or perhaps, you know, citizens of Europe or even South Africa, who go to Jerusalem and then enter the, you know, either, you know, with their families or alone, enter the homes of Palestinians and say, we're taking over your homes and you need to leave, right? And if Palestinians refuse, right, then they're met with violence, either by the settlers themselves or, you know, by the Israeli army that has recently intervened in support of these settler evictions, right? And, you know, the Palestinians in these neighborhoods had been facing this kind of pressure from settlers for quite some time, but most recently, you know, the Israeli court kind of approved these evictions, and the Israeli army became more mobilized in supporting the attempted expulsions of these Palestinians from their homes in those neighborhoods, right? Because that's what the Israeli courts are there to facilitate the colonizing project, not to bestow any kind of justice in what's going on in places like Jerusalem. And so, you know, that kind of had come to a head in particularly where a lot of Palestinians in other areas of Palestine were seeing what was going on. A lot of people around the world were seeing what was going on. At the same time, too, you know, during the holy month of Ramadan, that's when a lot of Palestinian Muslims, and, you know, this week before also was Holy Easter. That's when a lot of Palestinian Christians and Muslims will come to Jerusalem or attempt to come to Jerusalem to pray, right? And one of the places where folks pray, the Holy Sepulchre Church, which was met with violence a week before, and then the Aqsa Mosque, which was met with extreme violence at that time by the Israeli military, right? And that caused sort of a wave of Palestinians in the West Bank and then in the 48 territories to then come out and rally and try to reach Jerusalem and resist what the Israeli army was trying to do, to attack worshipers and to prevent people from going to Jerusalem, and, you know, to try to prevent it. The Palestinians are also trying to prevent the Israeli army from, you know, continuing these evictions, and then that also you know, resulted in sort of Palestinians also outside of Palestine, also sort of like organizing in a show of resistance to what Israel had been doing in Sheikh Jarrah and Aqsa Mosque, including in Jordan and in Lebanon, and as you see here in the United States. But, you know, those are the recent events, but what we know also, right, and including the bombing of over 300 people in Palestine, killing like several, you know, children and women, which is not a new occurrence, right, as I was saying before. But, you know, those are certainly recent events, but the fact of the matter is that, you know, it's been over a century of colonial violence. That is the backdrop and the context in which the recent moment of Israeli attacks and the recent moment of resistance exists.
And something I like to bring up as a very kind of removed outside observer is that the Netanyahu government has been one of the worst governments I've seen in the world for the human rights violations that have been going on. And he's obviously failed to form a government 4 times in the last 2 years. He's under indictment. And from my understanding, there was a coalition party with a coalition movement to get him out days before a lot of the violence and evictions really started escalating in Jerusalem. Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you been? Do you ever frame it with Netanyahu as trying to start a war, start this violence to try to stay in power?
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, clearly that's something that goes on. Every time there's an Israeli election coming up, they start bombing Gaza to distract people. But it's also true that across the political spectrum, in 48, in the 48 territories, meaning within the Israeli state, all the political parties, all the Jewish political parties support Zionism. They all support the wars on Gaza. They may not necessarily support every eviction that takes place, but if they don't, it's only because they want to maintain the fiction that Israel is a democracy and somehow not what it in fact is, which is an apartheid state, as Suzanne mentioned, now even acknowledged by Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization. So it's only to maintain the apartheid regime that you get a little bit of dissent around the edges from some of the more liberal Zionists. But even they, when push comes to shove, whether over there or over here, nonetheless support the wars. They support US weapons going to be used for that purpose. And so it appeals, yes, it's a distraction that Netanyahu uses, but he also appeals to a pre-existing and ongoing support for Israeli apartheid and ethnic cleansing. And so it's not really a question, therefore, of just Netanyahu, any more than it was a question of just being Trump in this country. I mean, of course, we're glad to get rid of Trump in this country. But the fact is that Biden now is sending weapons just as much as Trump did, and just as much as Obama did, and just as much as every other administration did to kill Palestinian children, of whom more than 50 have been killed. Just this round, 50 children, more than 50 children killed in Gaza by US weapons provided by a liberal democratic administration. So it's not ultimately about which particular politician or even which particular party is in power, either there or here. It's about a system of racism and apartheid and settler colonialism that exists on an international level. And that also is why I think you've got growing recognition, not only in general and around the world, but certainly in this country. A lot of the support for Palestine comes from people in the Black Lives and Black Liberation movement and other movements of oppressed people in this country, indigenous people, because Palestine has always stood with those movements vocally and made clear the connections. And there's a chant that you'll hear at the demonstrations that from Palestine to Mexico, all the walls have got to go, referring to the apartheid wall in Palestine that separates Palestinians from each other and from their own country, and the border wall in this country, which again, under both administrations, Democratic and Republican, have been used to keep out indigenous people who are simply migrating to live, and from countries from lands that they themselves have been expelled from, as is the case for, say, Mexicans, Mexican migrants here. So these are connections. And if you look at the streets of, Ferguson in 2014, or Baltimore, or Minnesota, or Minneapolis today with George Floyd, to many people, the parallels are not hard to see between that and what we see on the streets of Palestine. The use of extreme militarized and military force against popular resistance to racism and injustice. And therefore, you see leaders of the Black Lives, or many leaders of the Black Lives movement, whether it be Angela Davis, who's spoken about Palestine all her life, going back to the 1960s, to Mark Lamont Hill, to the Black for Palestine groups, to the Dream Defenders, all expressing support for Palestine. And that has come to a new level. As Suzanne said earlier, it's a new moment right now. I mean, it's a new movement in terms of, in Palestine, of course, there's always been resistance there going back to the very beginning, and there always will be, just as there will be to any unjust regime around the world. But in Palestine, there is this sense, I think, of this is the moment, that the level of brutality is exposed, that the level of resistance has grown and expanded, and really given people hope that there's the possibility to bring down this unjust regime. And so in this country, we've seen the beginning of, for the first time ever, partial though it is, AOC, for example, has a bill to not allow $750 million in current military aid to go to Israel while they're bombing Gaza with that very military aid. Now it should be to eliminate all US military aid to Israel and to end all ties with that regime. However, the fact that even such a partial bill has come forward is really unprecedented. The fact that in the Democratic Party, you know, the popular opinion in the Democratic Party about people that vote Democratic is overwhelmingly not for Israel. And the polls that have come out in recent months and years, but especially right at this very moment, including among Jews, especially young Jews, who no longer buy into support for Zionist settler colonialism. And the Israeli regime is very concerned about that. They're desperately concerned about the rise of BDS. They're desperately concerned about the breaking through of their kind of propaganda, even into some of the mainstream press, as Suzanne mentioned, and especially the alliances that are formed between racial and social justice movements in this country, like Black Lives, with Palestinians. These things frighten them to death, which is why they respond with trying to outlaw BDS in this country. They respond by witch hunting people like Angela Davis and Mark Lamont Hill and others who stand up for Palestine. And you know, for a long time that's worked. I mean, at least it's worked in the sense of not silencing those particular people who will never be silenced, but by setting an example of that you should be scared if you speak out about Palestine, you're going to be called anti-Semitic and so forth. That no longer is having the same effect. I mean, it does scare certain people, and it is, you know, a major deterrent to people speaking up. But increasingly, that's being broken through. And that gives us reason for hope. Resistance in Palestine, with resistance in this country and around the world, gives us hope, despite the terrible violence. And you know, all we can hope is that these, the massacres of these children and other people in Gaza, you know, is not in vain.
So I want to talk about the demands of Labor for Palestine and how people can support your organization. But before talking about that, I do want to kind of create, what is the vision of peace? What does peace look like? Because it's very easy to get pessimistic and cynical if you're someone who believes in the United Nations change of actually saying here's Gaza and West Bank, here's where the Israelis are going to go, and then you see how those little green spots of Palestine have been shrunken and shrunken again and again. And you see Jerusalem, that was this idea of having a United Nations controlled city that was going to be used by Muslims, Christians, and Jews. It's now completely controlled by one of the religions. And I think some of the things that I've read is that the goal of Zionism is to ultimately push out all of the Palestinians into Jordan, into Egypt, and seize all the land as the old kingdom of Israel. And I'm just wondering, like, how do we step back from this current dynamic that's going, and what does peace look like? And what does a government look like that is just and allows the Palestinians the agency and dignity that every human deserves?
Well, I think that what has been a vision, right, for the future that has existed really for a long time among the Palestinian movement is this idea of a one-state solution, similar to you know, what we've seen take shape in South Africa, even though we know that that's sort of far from perfect, with the sort of the continuation of economic apartheid, among other things, right? And it is really kind of a luxury to be able to kind of like spend time on sort of thinking about that vision, right? Because there's so much that Palestinians have to contend with. But I think that the liberal forces and the right-wing forces have really kind of like tried to push this idea that the only solution is a two-state solution, right? And that is impossible, right? I mean, and you sort of referring to the little kind of like green marks on the map now, where Palestinians are confined to. It very much in kind of like Bantustans were in South Africa, right? And it's also impossible because it also kind of still maintains kind of this powerful Israeli regime and subjugated people who then have to kind of like live within those confines. And I think that idea was also kind of the impetus for pushing the Oslo Accords back in 1993, was it, right? And all that did was really help to sort of solidify and ferment the occupation and increase it, and and actually cause more exploitation and subjugation of Palestinian people. So, I think, as I said, like the vision of the one-state solution is actually one that has existed for a very, very long time among sort of Palestinian resistance movement, and I think it's one that's also kind of been recognized as the path forward, not just for the Palestinian movement, but for allies and solidarity activists and Palestinians living in diaspora. Now, to talk about exactly what that looks like, I mean, it has to include the sort of the decolonization of Palestine in all of its manifestations. Palestinian refugees, there are up to 5 million now, who many of these refugee camps were created in 1954 and in 1967. They have the right under international law to return to their homes. That has to be part of that vision, right? And also, what needs to be part of that vision is, we can't attempt to have a one state when we still have an armed police force representing kind of a power elite, over, the indigenous population that like we're seeing in South Africa. So there's a lot to discuss about that, right? And, as Michael said, there's a lot of hope right now. It is an important moment. I think one of the places, though, that like it is a challenge is that the truth is that there's very little resistance to Israeli settler colonialism within Israeli society itself, right? I mean, there are liberal elements that are saying Palestinians have human rights, but there's just not enough. Well, honestly, there's a great deal of mainstream Israeli society that is openly supporting the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. You should see these interviews that Abby Martin did on the streets of Israel. But even those who are, challenging Israeli violence against Palestinians just don't go far enough. They still don't want to challenge the very sort of power structure that is the Israeli regime. And they're going to have to go farther than that if we're going to be able to talk about kind of the future and a vision of a one-state solution. And Michael, you might have something to add to this.
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, Suzanne said it all, but the bottom line is that all of Israel, so-called, is occupied Palestine. And the idea that you can have an occupation regime continuing to exist is simply not acceptable. It wasn't acceptable in South Africa. It wasn't acceptable in Zimbabwe, and it's not acceptable in Palestine. And the interesting thing about one state as well is that, one state meaning that everybody would have equal rights, one democratic state, one democratic secular state, throughout historic Palestine with equal rights for all. From the river to the sea is the phrase that is used to meaning decolonization. And decolonization, it should be clear, is not about getting rid of people. It means equal rights for everyone. The Palestinian movement has made that very clear. And it also means, one person, one vote, and democratic process, minority rights, and so forth. But it means an end to the Israeli regime, because the regime may be Israel temporarily, but the country is Palestine, and it always will be Palestine, and that's what we're fighting for ultimately. Most immediately, we're fighting, what the BDS movement is calling for, and it's reflected in this ultimate goal. But the BDS movement doesn't specifically address the question of how many states. What the BDS movement says is that it demands an end to the 1967 occupation. That means the land that was stolen by Israel in 1967, the West Bank and Gaza in particular, in Jerusalem. But also an end to Israeli occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, and full equality for Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel, and implementation of the Palestinian refugees' right to return, as Suzanne has said. What's interesting again is that not only is there growing support for BDS, but there is growing support, or at least a hearing, for the idea of one democratic state. I mean, the reality is there's already one state. It's just that it's an Israeli settler colonial regime state that dominates the 48 areas and the 67 areas, and continues to maintain the forced exile of up to 7 million Palestinian refugees. The only question then is, what kind of state is it going to be? And so we're saying, rather than being the current apartheid ethnic cleansing regime, it should be a democratic, a secular one state for all. And you begin to see reference to that, and even advocacy of that occasionally, in the op-ed pages of the New York Times for the first time ever. Now, overwhelmingly, what's in the New York Times, certainly in the reporting side, is still the traditional Israeli Zionist narrative. But the fact that, when resistance exists, as it does in Palestine, and when it grows, as it is in Palestine, to the levels that it is at right now, or for that matter, when the Black Lives Movement in this country was able to, over the last year, become such a major force, so many millions of people coming out, the largest number of protests actually in US history, millions and millions of people on the streets. That doesn't necessarily change the systems itself, but it does, begin to break down the dominant narrative. And that's what we're seeing in regard to Palestine now. We're seeing people talking about one state in the mainstream. Not as much as it needs to be, and certainly still in the very small majority, but it's begun to be heard. The fact that there has begun to be opposition expressed to why is the United States arming the bombardment of Gaza and the maintenance of the Israeli apartheid state. These things all of a sudden are being heard, at least, because of the resistance that's going on the ground in Palestine and the resonance that has in this country and around the world. And that is reason for hope.
So Labor for Palestine, how can organized labor workers around the world support the mission of Labor for Palestine? What are some of the key demands that you think can move this forward?
Well, the simple answer is that we would welcome you to endorse our statement, which is posted at laborforpalestine.net, or contact us at info@laborforpalestine.net. But more generally, we are calling for support for BDS. We're calling for labor organizations to formally endorse, to cut off ties with the Histadrut, the racist Israeli Labor Federation, and its supporters here in the Jewish Labor Committee. It's the same thing. And again, to emphasize that, Jewish does not equal Zionist. There are many Jews, including myself, who are anti-Zionist. Zionism is not an expression of Jewish identity. It is an expression, unfortunately, of people who believe in Jewish and white supremacy. But there's a growing number of Jews and there's always been anti-Zionist Jews, and there continues to be, if anything, more and more as time goes on. But we do believe that that labor has to get on the right side. Labor has to be on the right side, whether it comes to Black lives and Standing Rock in this country, indigenous struggles. It has to be on the right side in Palestine. It's the same kind of issues. These are the same racial and worker justice issues. And labor cannot thrive. I mean, labor is under tremendous attack in this country and only represents now 6% of the private sector working class. And, so labor has to be reinvigorated, it has to be re-democratized, and it has to be re-energized and re-empowered. And it can only do that by being part of these intersectional mass movements for justice. In fact, if anything, that is going to be the critical thing. Without doing that, labor is not going to go anywhere in this country. It has to be alive and part of the Black Lives Movement. It has to be part of the Indigenous rights movement. It has to be part of the migrant workers' rights movement. And it has to be part of the worker solidarity with Palestine movement. Until it has that kind of moral credibility and understands the need for solidarity across all of those kinds of different things, it's not going to go anywhere. And we're going to be in continual decline. So it's a survival thing for all of us to be in solidarity with each other, because none of us can get free on our own. None of us can be free until we're all free.
And Suzanne, any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I just want to kind of re-emphasize what Michael said, that I think that, examples that we've seen, we have seen some examples in the past decade of union locals and workers coming together to push their leadership to support the demands of BDS. And they have been met with a lot of opposition, but they've been consistent. So that's very helpful. But I think, the opposition that they've experienced from their leadership is certainly kind of representing a crisis of union democracy, right? And I think that that's a very important point. One of the locals, I believe it was in 2014 or 2016, that did pass a resolution, like amongst their base was actually a lot of healthcare workers, right? People kind of expect this kind of thing from like academics and whatnot. And, those experiences, and I work with a lot of, migrant farm worker organizations and workers in rural areas. And, what I have found was that, the working class can very much, in fact, relate to Palestinians and what Palestinians are going through. But the problem is that, there's leadership in the labor movement, and there are gatekeepers in the labor movement that prevent those conversations from even coming into those spaces. And that's what we really need to resist, not just around Palestine, but also in all the ways that union dues or our tax money is used to oppress anyone. Mm-hmm.
Michael and Suzanne, Labor for Palestine, thanks for all your work and everything that you're doing.
Thanks for having us.